Welcome everybody, and of course what we're going to talk about today is what's been almost, one would say, the first thing on everyone's mind if you're India and thinking international, which means what is changing with the US, what ought to, what ought not to. I think what we've been seeing is a sort of a narrative, a popular simplistic narrative perhaps around in India, which suggests India is in the frontline, good guys pitted against the bad guy China, holding hands with another bad guy, never mind who, and that this is a beginning of a new alliance of the good. And the thing with the popular narratives like this, they may be unsophisticated, may even be untenable, but they can be powerful, particularly if they have the perceived backing of the government of the day. And there is without doubt some substance to this. I mean, we've been seeing Australia militarizing heavily, opening its bases to India. We've seen Japan sharing intelligence with India over the border issues. The US, of course, we see what it is doing, and we'll hear more on that very quickly. So just to remind ourselves who we are that are speaking amongst ourselves. Also the candidate from Harlem for the New York State Senate. And he's somebody who has spent a long time in handling large-scale corporate data and issues around that. He's been the director of several such companies. He's also been involved in faith issues. It's not often that you see someone doing those two together. Dr. Aparna Pandey, director at the India Initiative, at the Hudson Institute in Washington. And her latest book, and we can see that right behind her, the title, Making India Great, The Promise of a Reluctant Global Power. Now, I'm reluctant to guess what that might mean, but we'll hear from you, Aparna, in just a bit. And of course, Salil, who several of us know, he's a writer based in New York. He's earlier worked in India, Singapore, Hong Kong, London. He's a writer at Caravan India, and he's chair of the Writers in Prison Committee of PEN International. And some of us know Salil to be always refreshing and unapologetically direct. So on this, with this very short indication of the framework around which we'll be speaking, Aparna, say your thoughts.
Thank you. Morning and good afternoon. I'd like to thank Bridge India, especially Salil and Prateek, for inviting me. Relations between India and the United States actually date back centuries. We can go back to even before 1947. And the relationship is often prone to high-sounding names. The oldest and the largest democracies, natural allies, natural partners, defining partnership of the 21st century. From the 1990s, successive American administrations and Indian administrations have attempted to forge a multifaceted relationship, which I believe has by and large three pegs: economic, strategic, and there's the people-to-people dimension. The people-to-people dimension actually has is reflected not just in the 4 million Indian American diaspora, but also the hundreds of thousands of students, businesses, and people of Indian citizenship, including myself, who work in the country. Yet, demands of nationalism have led to actions like some taken this year, which is limiting not just foreigners, but not just foreign workers, but even foreign students from coming to the country. And that will have an impact on Indians and how Indians see the US in the coming years. Secondly, India lies at the heart of the US Indo-Pacific strategy. Washington does view India as a potential counterweight to a rising China. Yet, US cannot help noticing India's unwillingness to exercise hard power or agree to military alliances. Washington views the rise of China as separate from what happens in the Middle East or South and Central Asia. For Delhi, however, India is concerned not just about the spread of China in the South China Sea and the East China Sea, but the Indian Ocean region, which means from the Gulf, Central Asia, South Asia, and especially Beijing's deepening presence in India's neighborhood and on the Himalayan border, as we can see has been happening since April. And India believes India is alone in that contest. Finally, the India-U.S. bilateral trade relationship is less than $150 billion annually, which, considering the size of the two countries, is quite low. Both sides have often said you would like to boost it further. There's talk of a trade deal, mini or large, talk of moving supply chains or restructuring supply chains. So strategically, Washington's desire to combat the rise of China should translate into helping India's economic rise. But populism dictates a protectionist American trade policy. Similarly, to achieve its developmental goals and global ambitions, India needs to focus on economic growth and military potential. But nationalist and populist urges lead to a focus on more religious and cultural issues and protectionist trade policies. I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oz, some thoughts from you before we launch into a discussion?
Sure. I think Aparna raised a lot of key issues there. A few things I would add is that India started a military refresh a few years ago, and it's now a mixture of Russian and American product that's coming in. So there's questions from an American policy perspective. We also, as of yesterday, announced that we're moving AFRICOM, which is the Africa Command. And so there's now a opportunity for India to play a more regional role, but the question is what that regional role is. We've got ongoing questions of cyber terrorism and I would say cyber hegemony pushes from China. Also the risk of the rise of ISIS coming up again, and their funding of proxies throughout the region, which goes back to 2611, a few other things that were out there. And then lastly, I think COVID has raised a lot of issues. India had taken a protectionist strategy early on this year. We still have questions in terms of the rise of COVID populations that we're seeing both in India and the United States. And then the questions of how that is going to affect trade relations longer term, as well as India's relationships with Russia. And as I think Aparna so astutely pointed out, the religious issues, the issues around 370, the issues around Assam, and the fact that I've had, even my state in New York has put out condemnations against India from our state legislatures. So it's interesting to see where this is going to go and how this is going to shake out. But there's some good indications of what's next.
Salil, some thoughts from you before we speak further?
Yeah, sure. No, I agree with a lot that both Aparna and Oz have said. I mean, I think one of the things that we need to bear in mind is this assumption that because the two countries elect their leaders in participatory democracies, there is something common and mutual, and therefore something that can be built upon. I mean, nations, Kissinger had said it long ago, have permanent interests, and the values dictate up to a point, but not completely. And I mean, US and Germany, for example, right now are two large influential democracies, but they don't see eye to eye on many issues, climate being one of them, role of privacy being another one, response to COVID being another. And I can run a laundry list of issues where European Union and the US have a different view, although they are functioning proper democracy. US and Canada have had differences too, right, lately. So the idea that democracy can be a building bridge is problematic. There is, of course, an extremely warm, outwardly warm-looking personal relationship between the two leaders, President Trump and Prime Minister Modi. But whether it can be built into lasting strategic equations, I simply don't know. Because if we were to look at what are the issues that really matter to an Indian company that wants to operate in the US today, strategically, it would be things like easier access to H-1B visas. It would be easier access to IT companies or biotech companies which want to operate in the US. And it would be to lure American investment which might want to rejig the supply chains and move away from China and go elsewhere. But if we really look at it, the beneficiaries of the investments that are moving out are likely to be ASEAN countries, from China, It's not going to be in India for a whole host of reasons. I mean, India's infrastructure still remains, in shambles, and, it's not something that can easily, you can't replicate something out of, except for some industries. It's not that easy to do so. And what the US wants out of India, which is an open services sector for us, whether it's law, whether it's banking, finance, and although India is extremely reluctant. Walmart would love to open, but the large Indian companies will not want it. They will have to strike deals with Geo, for example. Facebook and Google have started doing it. So I think there are lots of permanent interests that both countries do have, which is going to prevent the kind of delay. And India has been historic, to build on Oz's point about cyber terrorism is fine, but military alliances, India is historically, and I think no Indian government would agree to stationing foreign troops on its soil, for example. So if the idea is to have some kind of a command post in, let's say, the Andamans, to look at the Indian Ocean, for example, I see that as a non-starter. Now, I don't speak as a strategic analyst here, but I mean, instinctively, it just seems to me that no Indian government would agree, whether it is Congress, whether it is the left front, or whether it is the NDA.
Well, but I doubt that America is in a rush to send troops to the soil in India or anywhere else for that matter for the moment. But we'll come to that. But arising from what you said, and also Aparna and Oz, there are issues of geopolitics and strategic issues here. And in that context, the Indian External Affairs Minister Jaishankar said that the US needs now think afresh about allies, away from traditional allies, and look at new strategies, new structures. Clearly, he would have meant that there is a world to ally with beyond Western Europe and beyond NATO. Now, that comes from the Indian External Affairs Minister, that comes from India. What is the likely response from the US? Aparna?
So I would say this, that, it is easy for a country which was non-aligned and which doesn't have alliances and has always sought to change the global global institutional structure, whether it is the United Nations or financial institutions, to accommodate a rising India. And other countries, whether it is, Brazil or Germany or others. It is very difficult for an existing alliance structure to suddenly change overnight. So yes, India can talk about the fact that the US should make exceptions, and we should be clear, the US has made exceptions for India. The India-U.S. civil nuclear deal is an exception. India is a major defense partner is an exception. India being given STA-1 authorization on the commercial sector is an exception. US has, among most others, supported India on the U. So I believe we have got a lot of exceptions. Maybe what we can hope for is the Quad becomes something which is not NATO and, not an alliance. But will the US actually disband its existing alliances? I don't know. Maybe it will over a period of time.
But are these exceptions more in protocol than in substance? The nuclear deal and the defense deal has not led to very much. The defense deal is very limited, and India is looking at Russia and France and elsewhere very much more than the US would like. It's one thing for governments to, sit in the State Department or in South Block and at the world and come up with policy speeches. But how substantial has this been?
I mean,
it's interesting. We're in over 60 treaties and agreements right now that would require the United States to pull the war trigger in the case of, basically any incursion on our allies. So from an allyship perspective, I think we're in cruise control. But I think Aparna raises some really, really interesting points here. India, not just as a growing superpower, is a strategic asset in the region in a number of ways. But the question has been for the last couple of years, what's the balance, what's the dance in between Russia relationships and American relationships from a military perspective? Who are you going to buy from? Who are you going to utilize tanks from? Also, what should we be selling you guys if you're buying Russian rocket launchers? You got the S-300s over here, and then you're buying ammunition and a few other things from us. There's a reluctance to sell you some of this heavy hardware. At the same time, we've sold everything outside of the F-35 to Pakistan. And then you start looking regionally in terms of what the hegemonical plays are. I mean, you've got everyone coming at you from the north, pretty much. You know, you've got terrorists coming from Afghanistan. You got a little bit of a tense relationship with Pakistan. You've got China, you know, doing everything, including propaganda, and now I would call it cyber terrorism in terms of what's happened. The full ban of applications, and now President Trump making TikTok's parent divest from the American perspective. So I think there's new trade alliances that can be built, but the foundations of these are going to have to be looking at a bit of a reset from a policy perspective in terms of some of the existing things that have happened, you know, through the Obama administration, the Bush administration, even going back to the Clinton administration. Inside of a COVID era where, you know, we've seen not just the depression level collapse of the economy globally, but something that's a recession that we have not experienced, I think, in over 200 years. You would really have to go back that far to the collapse of slavery in other countries, to the collapse of large economic empires, to see a 33% decline in GDP, right? But that's what we're doing.
Salil, you were talking about the fact that it's not enough that India is a democracy, the US is a democracy, therefore they will deal with each other in a way that's the best way for both. The US has a pretty long history of dealing supportively with countries that have not exactly been democracies. So the self-interest is prime. But given that there are now common strategic interests, never mind the commonality of democratic structures, given the strategic commonality, how far do you think the US and India can go together? Could it go as far as approaching some sort of military alliance?
Well, it would really depend. I mean, to go back to military alliances, it would depend on what exactly Oz was talking about, that India does like to diversify its supply base, for example. It does like to mix and match things, and it insists on domestic production fairly quickly. I mean, whether it is HAL or DRDO that does it in India, or whether it is a private entity, that's a separate question, and an interesting and controversial question in the Indian context. And well, let's not get into that yet. But I think to what extent would that kind of transfer of technology really be possible? And that exactly goes to the heart of the nuclear issue that you were raising, you know, that Manmohan Singh put his entire political capital on the line and managed to get it through. But I mean, you know, because of the liability issue and because of the very bitter experience India has had with Bhopal and Union Carbide, India has been extremely reluctant, you know, to address the issue of liability. And while that remains, as I mean, those are, I think, pretty formidable positions to budge from. I'm not saying that, you know, one should never say never. I mean, things can change significantly and drastically. And, you know, there is always a black swan moment, and COVID is one such, and, you know, which completely transforms the way we look at the world. So something can indeed happen which changes it. But if assuming things stay the way they are, I don't see, and also the historic reluctance, you know, to have stationing troops on Indian soil. So yes, there would be, you know, high altitude warfare practice, I mean, training in the Himalaya, for example, some forays in the Indian Ocean with the Blue Water Navy and so on. But beyond that, I mean, I'm not a defense expert, but I don't see that very likely to happen.
I don't think we'd ever drop a base in you guys, but we'd be happy to park the fleet.
Yes,
the reason I keep bringing up the issue of base is only because Sanjay does mention the post-NATO environment, and NATO does involve stationing troops in other countries with agreement and with consent and all of that. So I'm not saying it's an imposition by any means, but I just don't see how an Indian government would agree to that in the current context.
Well, that is not on even at the discussion stage as yet. We're talking about, and I think Jaishankar was not speaking of an alliance that goes that far in the foreseeable future. The question really is how far the US would be prepared to think of new alliances that do not necessarily entirely replace NATO, but which will include prominently alliances with India. How far do you think the US would go?
So India's strategic
and Oz, and of course,
No, the strategic importance is without question. It is in a crucible. It is a nuclear power state. There is Pakistan, and there's a whole history behind it. Containing China is also in the interest of the United States. So all of that is definitely meshed in. So yes, there are lots of things that are coming together in this equation. Now, whether that's sufficient to overcome the historical baggage that we are aware of is an open question.
Oz, you were speaking about cyber terrorism. Tell us a little more what you mean by that. And do you think that the US and India would work together substantively to some extent to deal with counter this kind of a cyber terrorism from China? Because that necessarily is not aimed just at India. US has been a target, as we've heard often and emphatically.
Oh, absolutely. And they're going after critical infrastructure. They're going after power plants. They've got EMP devices now that can knock out cities that are submarine based. So there's a lot of strategic concern, I think, here. India has been a good ally for us on a number of fronts, and they've been a challenging ally on a couple other fronts. I'm just going to walk through the issues. We'd like to see India liberalize a lot of regulations in terms of industry, which would open the doors for American companies to come in, for us to have more participation. We're already looking, and we have companies looking to India to pull out entire supply chains from China, because no one's going to be able to guarantee the safety and security of their products. Also, a lot of the raw materials for what's being manufactured inside of the PPE industry right now, which is all the rage in terms of what people are buying, the raw materials come from India. But there's questions that still linger about, CMM certifications, ISO certifications, and the validity of some product coming over. There's questions in terms of fraudulent goods from a variety of American, companies that are ostensibly sometimes manufactured over there. There's the question of the military issue in terms of, what is India going to do? What are they going to pull the trigger on? There's the question of China and China's hegemonical pushes, not just in the South China Sea, in India, with the Belt and Road Initiative through Pakistan and what they're basically buying people off for. I think, look, we will never probably put a base in India unless there's some large scale push by China and Modi and Trump, have a discussion. But we're pretty happy to park the 7th Fleet off of, one of your shores and just make China put a notice in that regard. But you factor in all these facets. You look at what American manufacturers and manufacturing associations, as well as business associations, are looking for. And you have to ask that question, is the union ready, right? Is the union ready for a larger scale relationship? And, some of the points that Aparna pulled out and some of the stuff that Salil has so articulately, laid out, the questions really lie on what are the next steps that India is going to take, because this is a game it was a game of checkers at one point. It's now a game of chess.
Aparna, how far and how effectively do you think the US will go in backing India against any aggression from China, whether it's physical on the border or of the cyber kind that Oz has been describing?
So the cyber kind, I think, is an easier answer to give, because it's a cooperation which has taken place for a long time, and that can continue. It doesn't necessarily come in the eye, and it's sort of, it's something which India is also going after, cyber, and sort of, banning those apps and everything. So that is the easier side. It's sort of, it's something. The tougher one is something, one at a time when the US is semi-isolationist. And is actually withdrawing troops. Yes, it may be sort of moving them from Europe to the Pacific. We can leave that part out. But if you are semi-isolationist and you want your allies to do more, or you want your potential allies or partners to play a bigger role in their region, there is going to be a reluctance to actually send out troops. Thirdly, let's not forget that what the US can do will depend on what India wants the US to do. As a country which has valued independence in decision making, which has sort of, pushed the fact that we will take a decision based on our interests, even if it makes it unpleasant for others, whether the United States or, Soviet Union or Russia or anybody else. So, you want independence in defense manufacturing. So you will try to manufacture locally. You will purchase from Russia and Israel and France and US. You will
But
not be.
yes, speaking trade and what India will buy, because ultimately a lot of the exchanges and a lot of decisions you take are based on your advantage in what you may have to buy and what you would want to sell. We had Piyush Goyal saying just a few days back that some sort of a limited trade deal with the US is just a phone call away.
Mm-hmm.
Are we close to something, and what might that be?
I'll give the short answer, which is I mean, I don't really see anything beyond, something which is, you're giving sort of the US says, okay, we will restore GPS, the GSP, references which were taken away, about $6 to $8 billion, gives us something easy to do by executive order, don't really need to do more. I find it very difficult sort of to see how it's going to go beyond that at a time when you're talking about Atmanirbhar Bharat and you're talking about self-sufficiency and a semi-protectionist. I do not see how you're going to go for even a mini or a major trade deal.
No, I would
if
counter
India is
that.
speaking of Atmanirbhar, US is speaking a similar language. What kind of a trade deal do you think may be possible? Or let's put it this way, realistically, what would you like to see that you also think may be possible?
Sorry, you're asking Oz, me, Salil?
sorry, Oz, that was for you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would I would counter what Aparna said, and I would say, look, a trade deal is easily facilitatable right now, and it is a phone call away. But I think a couple of issues are going to play in. One is the issue of religious rights. We just wrote the Uyghur Act for China, and it's like, look, you're not going to fix the concentration camps, you're not going to change these things, we're going to put economic sanctions on you. You guys have the issue with Jammu and Kashmir and the depossession of the people of Islam and the Muslim people. There's questions about the treatment of Christians as well by Hindu nationalists, by some of the BJP folks out there, and there's a lot of questions in terms of what is India doing in terms of modernizing or liberalizing some of your regulations around a number of industries where the U.S. could participate better. So, where I think this could go, I mean, like, look, I personally think that we're in a COVID lull right now because of the temperatures and a variety of other factors, and a bunch of constraints have been put in place by your government in the union and ours in our republic. But we are going to get spikes. A lot of these other things are mitigating factors. So I think that there's a short-term trade deal that could come into play, largely because we're going to need to support each other. We are going to need the goods. We're going to need the medicines. We are going to need a variety of other, supplies from each other. We're going to need a lot of technology transfer. But what we're going to see for the next 24 months, and this affects the H-1B issue. This also affects a large number of issues with companies coming or going to either country, and the virtualization of the resources related there too, is that COVID has shut borders. We have entire countries that have said, nope, you're not coming here anymore. And that's going to continue. And we don't really have a end time frame for this. The pandemic in 1919 probably took about 2-3 years. I think we're looking at that type of a cycle here. But inside of that, short-term gains can be won. And look, things are changing on a weekly basis here. If China basically rolls over your border again, trust me, we're moving military forces there within 24 hours. They won't be on your shores, but they will be off of your shores, and they'll be readily available.
Oh, well, that's an interesting forecast. We do hope it's not put to the test. But Salil, you have been speaking about the gulf between ideological positions and trade interests. How wide is that gulf today between the US and India? And what do you think could be done on the trade front to at least narrow it?
So the worry I have, I mean, yes, in theory, I agree that, some kind of a deal may be possible. I'm not going to speculate which areas and so on, but the key issues that both the sides want there is still a divide. I mean, that's one thing we need to bear in mind. And the other is that, I mean, yes, Oz is right, absolutely, in mentioning the need for drugs and medicines in the United States and in India being such a large supply. But we should not forget, the FDA queries in the Indian pharmaceutical sector and the whole Ranbaxy story, and Catherine Eban's wonderful book on, how the Indian pharmaceutical industry had lots of questions to answer in that regard. Now, while that remains in place, and while the Indian bulk drugs industry is still reliant on Chinese supplies for a lot of the material, I don't know how that triangle can be, all the dots can be matched into making the kind of triangle we want. And also, we should not forget this is an election year. We should not forget the 32% shrinkage of the GDP that Oz spoke about. And we should not forget that getting jobs at home in the United States is a priority. Mm-hmm. So I think it's going to be fairly hard to do anything that is genuinely beneficial for India and also for the US in the longer run, but which in the short term seems to be benefiting India more in terms of creating jobs in India. So I think it will, whatever trade deal that does happen will be commodity based, or something that is software transfer based or technology based, which doesn't require transfer of people across and maybe only of capital, and also the willingness on the part of the Indian side to let the capital come in. I mean, a lot of imponderables are there.
Yes, and of course we have, as you say, the election, and Oz might soon enough be an opposition man. But meanwhile, we have a few people writing in to us, and I put the question out for you guys to consider. This is from Jogal Saikia. And he says, what will be the impact on Indo-US relations after COVID-19 in terms of economy and human security? I know we've been talking about economy, but human security might be a particular interest subject to, and move our heads around. So what would the effect on that be post-COVID? Aparna?
Human security, I guess the person is asking about things like sort of impact on COVID causing deaths and things like that. I'm a little confused about what human security means. We're talking about environmental damage.
It could mean human rights too. Economic rights.
In that case, I am worried.
It's a rather loaded expression.
Yeah,
but,
it is.
That gives you the freedom to say what you want on this subject.
So, but I would say, one of the things which has happened and which has changed and will most likely continue in most countries is the surveillance, or, keeping track. Now, it can be done for the contact tracing and making sure that you know who all have got COVID, but it can be used by certain countries and certain states to actually keep a track on their citizens. And if that happens, then that is a problem. Plus tech companies keeping a track on everything what we are doing. So that is one impact. Finally, I mean, most states around the world have, and most countries, most cities even, have started to impose mandates. Now, it is good to have a mandate like a mask mandate, but will you, in a year later, for something else, issue some other mandate? So our states, local authorities and central authorities actually going back, are we going back to a sort of a time when the state strikes back? The state plays a bigger role. Rather than having a devolved state, are we going back to a state playing a bigger role in everything you are doing and using technology for it? That's what I would say. I'm worried. But
can I piggyback upon that? So India currently has 2 pilots that I'm aware of with American companies. These are startups where what they're looking at is digital national identity based upon your biometric security ID, basically your passports. So you can tie all this stuff to your passport. We had a huge issue here. There was a guy named Hone, who I know from the tech circles in New York City, who had lost access to a database of 150 million faces. And so, I think there's 4 factors here, from least onerous to most onerous, that I think we're going to be looking at. One is the face scanning, because the face scanning is everywhere. And 2 is the temperature scanning. And those are kind of linked, and you're going to see those large scale with thermal cameras absolutely everywhere. And that is going to limit people's mobility based upon what's going on with COVID. The next three are different. You know, we've got the opportunity to bring in blockchain-based systems and blockchain-based technologies. I spoke in Hyderabad and Goa in 18, and I talked to some government officials over there, but India is still kind of reticent to move that forward. In the United States, we've got regulators hemming and hawing and not necessarily wanting to make decisions, while European banks are pushing Ripple and a few other things into, you know, the ability for consumers to buy. But we have had big banking steps towards the utilization of cryptocurrencies. We're really talking about the blockchain piece here, which is like, how do you authenticate that to ledgers? How you know, land deeds, all this kind of stuff that they started in, what do you call Andhra Pradesh now? It was cut in half.
Telangana and Andhra Pradesh.
Thank you, Telangana. You know, those were the initiatives 2 years ago. Some of them have come into pilot, some of them come into fruition. There's utility with that in terms of some sort of biometric ID that people can verify things. Then there's a question of testing and invasiveness, okay? Because right now you've got Apple and a bunch of other people that are pushing into their operating systems tracking tools. And you guys kicked 40 Chinese apps out of your country, many of which were already tracking your citizens, right? So there's that third party question. And the last of this is what the Nordics seem to be so amenable to, which I think is just an onerous impact on from a religious perspective and just human rights, which is biometric chip implantation. And I think all of these things are going to become relatively germane inside of the next 24 to 36 months, because countries are going to be looking to knee-jerk to a lot of solutions. The technology is not well understood, and if something's presented in the right PowerPoint deck, and I say unfortunately, whether it's BJP or Republican Party here, or even Democrat Party, you know, that's how people buy.
Salil, human security sounds like your favorite subject.
Yeah, no, I'm a profound skeptic of this, because, I mean, facial recognition, tracing, tracking, surveillance are incredibly problematic from a human rights perspective. I mean, India did recognize the right to privacy in the Supreme Court ruling the other day, but, you know, there's one thing to have the right on paper and quite another, frankly, to have the right in practice. I mean, you know, until recently, if you wanted to board an aircraft or a train in India, you had to show your Arogya Setu app, you know, that you have it on, you know, and there was no other way to board a plane, which was, you know, a restriction on the right of freedom of movement. And it's fine, you know, even in terms of tracing and tracking, we all know that I'm sitting here on the ground floor of my apartment. If someone passes by 10 feet away and has COVID, my phone will probably capture it as an exposure, and I'm, you know, he has not sneezed near me, he's not anywhere near me, but I will be marked out as someone who is probably. So there are loads of false positives and false negatives, and both have consequences on ability to return to work or not to return to work, ability on people's income levels, and it has a significant impact on the poor and the vulnerable people. And we know how terribly the migrant workers were treated in India at the time of the lockdown. You know, it was an appalling, it was criminal, almost 130 million people or whatever the figure was, who were like led to march in a partition-like scenario. So given all of that, I think human security impact of what the technological determinism is promising to do, and biometric scanning, and it's, yes, everything works well if the country we're talking about is Norway or Sweden, you know, if you see what I mean, that, you know, with the kind of protections and safeguards you expect from a functioning democracy. But databases can be extremely problematic. We know that, I mean, you know, you reported out of Delhi, Sanjay, and I've reported out of Bombay many, many years ago. And, you know, voters list and identifying people by their caste and religion in the hands of the wrong political party and what it can do. I mean, you know that and I know that. And just imagine if it was significantly and quadrupled and quintupled in efficiency through a technologically track-based system in the hands of a government department which does not take human rights seriously. It will be catastrophic.
Oh, which China?
Could I just add to that?
China seems to be quite a dramatic example of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But sorry, Oz, you were saying something. I stopped you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, Salil, that's already a problem. The city of Atlanta, Georgia, put a mandate out that basically says they want people's personal information including social security numbers when tests are provided. And I'm like, so let me get this straight. You're going to trust some local administrator who's not using a government database with secured protocols on your PII or personal identifying information to just basically shuffle papers around? I mean, is this going to be like what you had with the 90,000 Villages program, where you're like, where's the data store for all of your patients? And they go, oh, it's in the back. And you go in the back and there's like a warehouse or like a farm shed, and there's like the papers are organized, but it's just stacks of papers. You know, there's serious security questions that I think have to be answered around this.
Yes, and these are questions. These are questions certainly for India, domestically for the US, but coming to matters between the US, certainly these issues that you describe are common concerns for civil rights, human rights, whether in China or India or in the US. But Aparna, what do you see coming in the election? And whatever does, do you think the democratic policies will be significantly different from those of this administration, if it were to come to that?
So we're talking about towards India, right? Or
Yes.
you're talking about
Yes, we are speaking
So India.
of
Okay.
the US election in terms of its India policy.
So I would say that, broadly speaking, there will not be a change. I'll mention the specific part where I think there will be a slight difference, but broadly speaking, no, because we've seen for the last, I would say from the time of President Bill Clinton onwards, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, there has been a broad strategic consensus, bipartisan, that India is important, India matters. So I don't believe it will change irrespective of who becomes president. However, I will say that there will be certain areas which India will face more pressure on if a Democrat president is elected. And that is the issue of human rights and the issue of, religious freedom. There will be more sort of statements. There will be more pressure on India. There has been slightly less pressure on India. There has been behind the door and in the Congress, but not as much. So I believe that pressure will increase. On the other hand, the strategic imperative on the economic, military, India will get some benefit on the people to people. The Democrats, Vice President Biden has basically said that, he will roll back some of the immigration measures, the H-1Bs and the others. So there will be some relief on that side, but there'll be some issues which matter to Democrats and which actually do matter to Republicans as well. Religious freedom does matter.
On the human rights issue, have there been any indications from the Democrats?
So I would say, last year, the sort of, the testimony and hearing on the Hill was led by a Democratic House Foreign Affairs Committee. So the Democrats have had hearings, and they had hearings last year, which didn't go well for India. And they have sort of, on a consistent basis, issued statements saying that India needs to do more in Kashmir. India needs to do more on human rights, and in that India-U.S. have a values-based relationship, and that values dimension means democracy matters.
Oz, do you see that anything will change significantly if the party that is not your favorite party were to come to power?
I think I should qualify that. I'm running as a reform Republican candidate for New York State Senate in Harlem, and I was a policy in counterterrorism, I guess you'd call it advisor to the Trump campaign in 2016. Trump and Rasmussen polls, Trump is his highest approval thus far and is polling 40% with black voters. So I think we are reasonably secure, although, look, it's 4 months, about 97 days, anything's up for grabs. And as we see, the landscape is changing significantly. So I'll go with your hypotheticals. Were things to change? Look, Biden's administration and whoever he picks as his vice president, who he's ostensibly said may end up running the government because I don't know if it's health issues or whatnot, there's not going to be a status quo change in terms of the perspective on human rights, but I think they'll be softer about it. The Trump administration has made absolute, not just overtures, but policy changes to ensure that the rights of people of religious faiths are protected. At the same time, the anti-human trafficking issue, regardless of who's in office, is going to change dramatically next year. There's $70 billion that's been greenlit for the 2021 budget, and there's going to be big conversations about the relationship that India has inside of that space, and what can be done to stop human trafficking, human slavery, forced labor, and a variety of other things. Now, there's overtures that have been made to China, and there's policy inside of that. And the only reason I bring this up is because where they're looking to go, I think, with emerging markets is a lot of uniform policy, at least from the Republican perspective. The Democratic perspective is yet to be seen. I've read a lot of the platforms that are out there for Biden. It's just challenging. You know, I think they'll be softer in China, which is going to be less advantageous to India. I think that you could look at almost a Ukraine type situation potentially happening under the Democrats, which would just not be good. And I think Jammu and Kashmir at that point could become buffer zones, which is also further problematic. And then I would say lastly, kind of looking at that in terms like, were you to say that the Delta happened, the H-1B issue still, you know, may not get resolved, because again, no one's going to want to open borders, especially to large numbers of folks coming over, when we're not necessarily sure what the solution parameters for COVID are.
Salil, you know, you mentioned this personal chemistry between Modi and Trump, and there's been a lot said about that and around that. Is that you know, familiar media hype of the predictable kind, or has that been influential in any particular ways? And do you think the lack of that, for the reason that Modi and Biden taken long together yet, could mean that what the Democrats would do would be different in any way as a consequence of that?
So I can't predict what a Modi-Biden relationship would be like. It's just way too speculative. I mean, I agree with both what Aparna and Oz have been saying, that, you know, substantively there won't be much of a difference. But the chemistry part, I think a lot of what we see, you know, whether it's the Namaste Trump event in Ahmedabad or the event that took place in Texas earlier, was essentially for domestic political constituencies, is the way I saw it. You know, basically it was a way for President Trump to pick up, you know, in what's going to be a close election, it seemed like. I mean, I'm not a political psephologist by any means, but I mean, what seemed, I mean, right now he's trailing, and therefore, you know, we don't know what is going to happen. So to get every vote that counts, and every vote that counts includes the wealthy Gujarati American Indian vote. And so if you are seen as a great buddy of Mr. Modi, that helps you. I mean, that's one thing. And even for Mr. Modi to show that, you know, President Trump is on India's side, you know, in a potential confrontation with China, or when Pakistan is so restless, and, you know, all those things. And in spite of the CAA, and in spite of all the problems in Assam with the National Registry, US is on our side, has a great resonance for a very core constituents in India. So the chemistry matters to speak to the base, and that is important. But whether that chemistry is sufficient to influence genuine strategic bilateral relationship, I simply don't know. I don't think it's similar to what Trump has, I mean, Modi has in relationship with Cameron earlier in Britain, or Boris Johnson. He goes to Wembley and does this big event. Who's the beneficiary? The Tory party, because he suddenly gets a lot of Gujaratis from Harrow going and voting for the Conservatives instead of Labour, for example.
That is very interesting, Salil. So, Aparna, as the numbers go, without getting predictive about it, in Britain, as Salil was suggesting, there are a number of constituencies that are called marginals, where the margin of the victorious candidate has been quite small, and the number of Indians quite substantial. So that theoretically, on many counts, because if Indians were to vote as a bloc, could actually tilt the result in that constituency. And then if the national result were to be close enough, could potentially tilt the national result as well. Could something similar potentially happen in the US?
So I will give the 2016 example. I mean, traditionally speaking, Indian Americans sort of, vote Democrat. About 85 to 90% of them have voted Democrat. However, in the 2016 election, there were a group of Hindu Americans who did support President, sort of at that time, candidate Trump. And in some of these states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and others. So they did support. Did they actually make a difference? One doesn't really know, but they did. And they have kept support for him. Now, what I would say is, we don't really know, and there's the push and pull. On the one hand, there are still Hindu Americans and Indian Americans who do support the Republican Party and who do support President Trump. However, some of the issues which have happened domestically in the US in the last 3-4 years, whether it is question of racism, question of immigration, question of rising nationalism and populism, has led a number of minorities, not just Indian Americans, to reconsider which party they vote for. So I cannot predict whether more Indian Americans will vote for President Trump this time, or whether they will go back to voting for Democrat. But from what I have heard, there hasn't been a significant change from the 85-90% of Indian Americans voting Democrat. That is where I will leave it.
I would counter that. I think you've had massive splits, massive shifts. Look, Bernie not being on the ticket has taken young Indian Americans, NRIs, and just a lot of folks that are out there, and said, we're not voting. We're not voting for Biden. We're not voting for that guy. And Bernie's still on the ticket in many states. Sorry, he's on the ballot in many states. So you're going to have some interesting things happening. We also have some third-party candidates that are popping up. Not necessarily worth mentioning, but you've got regional plays that could be factoring into this as well. But the Indian base, I would say, is probably at this point, I would say it's 60-40. 60% Democrat, 40% Republican. And a lot of this I'm seeing from, just what we had looked at in terms of the data and the donors for the Trump campaign in 2016 and local Republican races that we're seeing across the United States. The question, I sort of suppose, of where we go next with all of this is really going to come down to, some of the points that Salil was talking about, baked in with some of the points that Aparna was talking about. Where's the next shift in terms of how we can better work together? I think not just from the rallies that have happened between Trump and Modi do we have a reasonably good working relationship, but there's underlying sort of there's dances that are done between these two leaders that have to be kind of viewed in the context of what do they want to get out of these things and what's necessary from short-term gains, because that's really where most of the policy is being struck. We could probably get an agreement very quickly on the phone and get that codified, but it's going to be short-term gains. The longer-term question, a lot of the stuff that Aparna started out with, that I think is yet to be seen. And with things shifting geopolitically as quickly as they are, I think that's the best we can hope for at this juncture.
Well, in the end, we covered a fair bit of ground. China, trade, geopolitics, democracies, human rights, whatnot. I don't think we can wind up a discussion on where it matters, where it stands between India and the US, without even mentioning Pakistan, the old traditional, of course, ally of the US. Things have changed, but as with Pakistan, a lot of things in our territory. Aparna, do you think that this is a change that has come to stay, or is the US to an extent going to keep up parallel relations with both India and Pakistan that are productive for it?
I would say this is a change which is to stay. This is a change which has which started, I would say, in the George W. Bush administration when they de-hyphenated the relationship. and this is a change to stay. Pakistan hasn't really changed any of the fundamentals that the United States has repeatedly asked it to do. So this will change. However, doesn't mean that the US will give up on Pakistan. It is a nuclear armed country of 200 million people, which is strategically located. And as long as the US has an interest and has troops and people in Afghanistan, and has concerns in the Middle East, Pakistan, the relationship will continue. It will be more tactical. It will be more oriented towards achieving certain limited aims. But it will remain.
Your thoughts, Oz?
You know, yeah, India is a great ally, but Pakistan's an interesting ally, and they're one of our allies in the quadrilateral talks with Afghanistan, which we've been going through for 20 years plus with the Taliban, and China factors into that. And what happens is when you bring Pakistan into the equation, it really raises more issues of what the U.S. strategy is going to be longer term with China. We've got a lot of negotiating cards there because the expenditures that China has made in Pakistan, the foreign direct investments that they've made, which again, you know, could dovetail into a conversation about your independent strategy. Those are significant, and the U.S. has a lot of negotiating chips in terms of what we could do from anything from a sanctions perspective to a perspective of limiting trade to a perspective of, you know, do we want to continue to sell them military equipment? So it's an interesting dance there. I will have to say the Jammu and Kashmir issue, y'all have differing perspectives, okay? As an American Desi person who's also Arab at the same time, because, you know, product of war, it's interesting to look at. We're not necessarily as invested in the border issue, but I have to tell you that it's going to become a hotspot issue because China keeps pushing incursions in, and China has pushed troops through Pakistan before. So the question really becomes more of one of, you know, what is India's mettle to stand up to China, and does this result in any kind of, you know, I would call it clashes, because we've had clashes to begin with, but serious clashes, not necessarily war. And I don't know if China wants to run into war expenditures with India, because India doesn't play, you know, and we've seen this in terms of geopolitical combative situations over the course of the past 50 years.
Yeah. Yes, well, it is interesting that when it comes to Jammu and Kashmir, the Jammu and Kashmir state in India, human rights follows almost straight behind. But there's very little discussion on the human rights situation in Kashmir on the Pakistani side. And I don't know if that is because there just happens to be no independent media there. In India, one incident happens, it's in the news.
It's just largely that. You understand, I comb probably about 500 news sources a day just to get information, and to find out that Nepali television stations had blocked Indian broadcasts because they're calling them propaganda, I had to pull some local resource in North India. Like, it's hard to find information about these issues.
No doubt. Yes, no, there are no doubt Nepalese perceptions about the Indian government, about Indian television. But I was on the limited point on Kashmir,
Yeah.
where we hear very little from Kashmir on the Pakistani side. I don't think there is an independent international media presence there at all, unlike India. I don't think that the Pakistani media are free to go in there and report as they might want to professionally. There is certainly an issue there. And there have been ongoing issues in both Muzaffarnagar, around that area, and in Gilgit-Baltistan. So that has not been much in the public eye, but perhaps it is in the policy eye. Salil, what are your thoughts?
So the only thing I know, you're right that, you know, there is not that much presence of foreign media in what India calls Pak-occupied Kashmir and Azad Kashmir, whatever one calls it. But also it's not easy for even Indian journalists to go and report freely in what we call Jammu and Kashmir in India, right? I mean, it's not easy. I mean, it's not easy to get internet access and so on. So there are lots of restrictions on the Indian side too, which we do know, which we do not know about Pakistan. But what we do know is that Human Rights Watch did publish a very detailed investigative report about 3 or 4 years ago. I'm not exactly aware about when, about looking at the human rights situation in Kashmir, and of course in Pakistani administered Kashmir. And it's also when there was that big earthquake, there was a lot of scrutiny of that region and people were able to go in and out. So yes, of course, Pakistan should open up more. But, this is, I mean, if I were to, I mean, offer any suggestion to any Indian thinker on or strategic analyst, that why do you want to compare yourself with what Pakistan is doing? Why don't you compare yourself with what a good democracy that functions properly, what it should be doing? Why is it that you say, but because Pakistan does this, we will also do that? I mean, there should be better ambition than what I would argue.
No, that's quite right, Salil. You're absolutely right. Couldn't agree more. But I was speaking in the limited context of the US looking at this situation and setting policy accordingly, whether the Republicans look at it one way, whether the Democrats might look at it another way, and if they were to consider the human rights issue in Kashmir, whether they would also consider the human rights issue on the Pakistani side.
So I would slightly at an angle, I would look at it at a slight angle. I would look at it as a human rights situation in Pakistan in general, and where does Kashmir fit in? And I mean, again, I'm not looked at Pakistan Human Rights Watch or Amnesty report or the State Department report recently, but I would think the situation in Balochistan and Sindh are far graver. The situation of what happened to minorities, Ahmadiyas, and what is happening to the Baha'is in Pakistan, what is happening to the gay community in Pakistan, what is happening to the women in Pakistan, the Christians and Hindus. And I think those are fairly important issues which are on the horizon of people who do care about human rights in Pakistan. So Kashmir becomes part of that equation, but it's not as if, Kashmir is a sore point and the rest of Pakistan is doing very well. The human rights situation in Pakistan remains appalling, regardless of what they do in Pakistan-administered Kashmir.
Yeah, no doubt, but just on the question of how the US might be looking at it and how possibly another party government might want to look at it. Last thoughts from you, Oz, and then from you, Aparna, then we wind up.
Yeah, so as the US guy in the panel, in Pakistan, we have three concerns. We have the concern of the persecution of Christians, we have the concern of child brides, and we have the concern of honor killings. Okay, those are the three things that are going on. In India, we have in Kashmir, when it comes down to Kashmir, there's not enough information over here. So I will tell you that I know that there are abuses of the Ahmadis. I know there's issues in Gilgit because, look, Salil right now is in Brooklyn. I'm in Harlem. The Gilgit community is over in Queens. Okay, they're not too far from us, and they're relatively connected to the administration, and they've been pushing a lot of issues about this. So we do have some visibility, but you have to know people in the community. At the same time, we look at India and we look at the abuse of Muslims. We look at the issue of gang rapes. Well, we look at the issue of women's rights, and we look at again, you've raised LGBTQ issues. Look at them there too. It's an ongoing question from American policymakers as to what do you do about all of this. And all of that really kind of factors into, like, look, India and Pakistan just keep handing America negotiating chips in some of these larger geopolitical questions because those things aren't solved, those things aren't resolved. And when, you had 370 pulled and you started defrocking states of basically their rights and defrocking people of their citizenship, it also doesn't really give India a lot of room to question U.S. policy in terms of illegals or the immigration policy or a variety of other things. So that all of that really sort of bakes into what I think near-term negotiations are going to happen to be. But a lot of this is going to touch on, again, I think, what are the hot spots of the relationship? What are the near-term gains that can be made? What are the perspectives on China on a week-to-week basis? And, how can we really advance this? And just to talk, one last note I want to throw in here on the whole notion of Indian independence economically. American companies, as opposed to what happened previously, was like when Tata had to partner with any American company coming in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. You now have the opportunity for foreign direct investment from not just venture capitalists, but a lot of folks that'd be really happy to start building supply chains and bringing their know-how into India. And that could be very much like Pan Am's strategy of building airports, all across the Middle East. But I think there needs to be some business discussions, and those business discussions need to trickle into policy discussions with legislators and Modi and Trump, and that
Yeah.
can happen. But I would push on the consortiums inside of both countries to really start driving that.
Yes. Aparna, last word.
Just three quick things. One, sort of, issues which will matter in the coming months will be how and sort of, COVID and the continued impact of COVID on the region and beyond, the economic impact, the social. Second, China. China in the Indo-Pacific, China in the Quad, China in South Asia. And finally, we should not forget Afghanistan.
On the border.
On the border, yes. And we should not forget Afghanistan and the impact that Afghanistan will have on India-U.S., India-Pakistan, and, the sort of the broader impact on terrorism and jihad, broadly speaking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aparna. Thank you, Oz. Thank you so much, Salil. There's a lot of perceptions shared, much certainly for me to think about more, and for all of us. Thank you very much again for your time and for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.